Japan's #1 wrestling promotion is New Japan Pro Wrestling, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. But several other promotions lay a fair claim to the #2 spot, and the reason for that is pretty complex. It mostly comes down to who owns what, how you classify each one, and what sort of time frame and location you're talking about. So I'm going to tell you the cases for and against each one and try to qualify each answer. But first, some context. Historically, New Japan and All Japan Pro Wrestling have fought for the top 2 spots. Both came out of different philosophies originating from the legendary Rikidozen's JWA. After Rikidozen's death, his top 2 students Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba formed New Japan and All Japan respectively in 1972. Much of their success hinged on being backed by the major TV networks that aired them, with Asahi backing New Japan and Nippon TV backing All Japan. Both also had working relationships with the National Wrestling Alliance and the World Wrestling Federation in the 70s and 80s. Many promotions were either short-lived or had a specific featured style that would only attract a certain bubble of loyal fans. It's more or less still that way in the modern Japanese wrestling market, but All Japan had a massive departure in 2000 when its top stars left to form Pro Wrestling Noah, hence all the ARC iconography. Wrestling Association R folded specifically to send much of its roster to All Japan to help fill the void left by Noah, but All Japan never really recovered, and that's a major reason why New Japan grew to the #1 spot and pretty firmly stayed there. So for the #2 spot, I'll first make the case for modern Dragongate. Before the split with OWE in 2018 and the departure of its top stars Shima and Shingo Takagi, Dragongate was unquestionably the #2 promotion in Japan. But in the post-OWE split, attendance records for major venues like Korakuen Hall typically surpass the majority of other promotions that run there, and audience growth has been faster after relaxed pandemic regulations as well. When the return of cheering crowds were only allowed for 50% capacity shows, Dragongate also held out for longer so they could run full capacity shows with clap-only crowds instead. But we're not just talking Tokyo here. Dragongate is based out of Kobe, and the era of Shima at the helm led to the company's popularity spreading all over Japan, including touring in markets that most other promotions didn't go to, and often still don't. So on a nationwide level, sometimes Dragongate is literally the only game in town, and in some less traveled markets, attendance even comes close to New Japan numbers. But beyond simply ticket sales and attendance records, Dragongate was also an early adopter of streaming shows, formerly broadcasting pay-per-views on the Nico Nico service before moving to its own streaming network, as well as being owned by Gaora Sports, and more recently heavily sponsored by the Lek Corporation, and its lovable giant sponge mascot. They also have a vast history of merch sales due to their color-coded unit structure and flamboyant characters moving a lot of t-shirts, banners, and other various trinkets. Now, with that said, there are still plenty of markets where they're regularly outsold and their growth is outpaced. Stardom often has higher attendance records that have grown in the past few years, while most other promotions have dropped during the pandemic. And big Noah shows clearly have larger budgets since being acquired by CyberFight. So there are still cases to be made for other promotions, depending on specific factors. But if we're talking about all nationwide factors and widespread recognition, Dragongate is still holding the #2 spot you've heard about in years past. Stardom is by far the #1 Joshi, or women's promotion, in Japan, and also makes a strong case for the coveted #2 spot. It's seen an incredible amount of growth within the past few years, ever since 2020 when it was bought out by Bushiroad, the same company that owns New Japan. Bushiroad has since poured a lot of promotional budget into Stardom, and its numbers reflect that. But despite owning both, Bushiroad continues to run 2 separate streaming networks, NJPW World and Stardom World, rather than combining the 2. New Japan has also introduced an IWGP women's title belt that features Stardom wrestlers, so it also has some crossover. It's now basically a sister promotion to New Japan. So even though the numbers often surpass everyone else's, there are 2 arguments here. First, the question of whether or not to count New Japan and Stardom as 2 wings of the same wrestling company, and simply calling the #1 spot Bushiroad, which is a point that will be more relevant when I talk about CyberFight and its 4 promotions. Second, men's and women's promotions in Japan are still largely treated as separate entities. There's some pushback to the historical separation, especially in independent promotions that feature either intergender matches or mixed division cards. But that still isn't the norm yet in Japan, and the IWGP Women's Championship has so far not been a major fixture outside of its biggest shows. So the argument could easily be made that New Japan and Stardom are simply the #1 men's and women's wrestling promotions respectively, in different categories due to the gender separation. But Stardom doesn't hit as many touring markets, and attendance isn't as great in the smaller ones. So depending on your criteria, you could make a case for Stardom being co-#1, #2, or even #3. CyberFight is owned by CyberAgent, and it encompasses 4 promotions: Pro Wrestling Noah, Tokyo Joshi Pro Wrestling, DDT, and Ganbare Pro. Noah is CyberFight's flagship company, featuring many legends of the post-All Japan split who are still wrestling today. DDT also has a mix of competitive and comedic wrestling, with some of the wildest match stipulations you'll ever see, such as a battle royal that takes place on a commuter train. Tokyo Joshi Pro is pretty firmly the number 2 Joshi promotion behind Stardom, hence the point about whether or not to split hairs about gender categories and company ownership. Ganbare was originally a special series of DDT events, but later became its own promotion based in Tokyo. It's certainly up for debate whether CyberFight itself counts as a single wrestling company. If you were to combine the numbers of all 4, one could also argue that you'd have to treat Bushiroad's property the same way and consider Stardom part of New Japan's number 1 spot. But while Bushiroad keeps its streaming services separate, CyberFight offers all 4 of its promotions on the same streaming network, Wrestle Universe. So while none of the individual 4 promotions are anywhere near the top by themselves, by their powers combined, and the amount of crossover on their shows suggests that they have a legitimate claim to the number 2 spot as well. Just take a look at Keiji Muto's retirement show. Noah clearly has budget, and even though that show was in support of a legend, it's still a Noah show packing the Tokyo Dome. But it also should be said that the majority of all 4 promotions events are primarily concentrated in the Tokyo area, with only a few major markets like Osaka, Nagoya, and Sapporo on their tours, while Ganbare doesn't really tour on its own except as a combined DDT roster event. So that's why anything beyond the number 1 spot in Japan is sort of a confusing mess. Are you talking about widespread appeal and ability to move tickets and merch across nationwide markets? Or number 2 specifically in men's wrestling? Then Dragongate is still in the silver podium position. Are you talking about concentrated growth in the biggest markets, and not counting Bushiroad's properties as one? Then Stardom takes the spot. Or are you treating all properties as one entity or going by big budget events? Then CyberFight, as the sum of its parts, might also have a claim to that throne. But considering we still don't know how things are going to look in the next few years post-pandemic restrictions, perhaps the answer isn't to determine number 1 and number 2 spots at all, but rather to separate major promotions into tiers. While New Japan is still clearly in the top tier by itself, the tier below it includes several great promotions that are worth watching and subscribing to, depending on your tastes. And there's a distinct tier below that which is also well worth your time if you can find it. Much of it is simply free on YouTube. So that begs the question of whether these broadcasting and entertainment companies need to start taking on more independent promotions to make their services more viable to the public. I don't regularly watch everything CyberFight has to offer, but I can't deny that it's the best deal in town as far as sheer volume of content. Likewise, if Bushiroad were to combine its services for New Japan and Stardom, I'd subscribe to that in a heartbeat, but as is, I'd have a hard time justifying both subscriptions every month. And while I have a Dragongate Network subscription, I would wholeheartedly support the network taking on content from promotions they have working relationships with, like Ryukyu Dragon and Michinoku Pro, as well as their lucha affiliations in Mexico. Gaura also broadcasts several other wrestling promotions, and could even integrate All Japan into their network. But much of that has to do with the respective owners and TV broadcasting rights, so we might not see something like that anytime soon. Though using CyberFight as an example, things can always change. In any case, I was looking more to untangle the reasons behind this muddy situation than to find a definitive solution, so I hope you found this interesting. And as always, thanks for watching.